The snow fell soft and steady, swirling like ash through the lantern glow as Marshal Elias Boone rode into Eagle's Rest, his coat stiff with frost, his hat pulled low. Beneath his saddle, his horse moved slow, each hoof crunching the icy crust of a street that hadn't seen mercy in a long time. The town was quiet, save for the slurred hollers from a saloon and the wind that moaned like a widow left too long with her grief. Elias passed the old church, boarded since the preacher took ill last spring, and the general store, dark behind shuttered glass. Eagle's Rest had shrunk over the years, not in size, but in soul. Folks kept to their fences. They remembered too much and forgave too little. He turned toward the boarding house, where a lone lantern swayed near the porch. Mrs. Talbot stood there, arms crossed tight over her wool shawl, eyes like pins in the cold. "You heard," she called without warmth. He dismounted slow, giving his legs a moment to remember the earth. "Heard what?" "They're selling brides in the saloon tonight. 3 of 'em. Off the mail coach. No kin, no contracts. Just up for bid." He didn't speak, just looked past her toward the warm spill of light from the saloon windows, where shadows moved like ghosts behind stained glass. Mrs. Talbot sniffed. "Ought to be a crime." "It is," he said quietly. "Then I suppose you'll be arresting the whole damn town." He left her standing on that porch and walked. The wind pressed against him like a question he didn't want to answer. Inside the saloon, warmth punched him in the chest, cheap whiskey, sweat, cigar smoke, and something meaner. The piano was silent. All eyes turned as he stepped in, boots heavy on warped floorboards. They were on the platform near the piano. 3 women in dresses too thin for snow. A slip of paper pinned to each like they were livestock. Hazel Wynne stood tall, shoulders back, her eyes fixed somewhere just over the crowd's heads. She looked like a woman who'd memorized the Psalms and now was praying without sound. Her gloves were frayed. Her pride wasn't. Beside her was Letty Rose, barely 18, red hair tangled beneath a bonnet half fallen off. She glared at the crowd like she dared one of them to laugh. Her jaw jutted out, but her hands trembled around her skirts. The third woman stood slightly behind the others, older, her posture folded in like a letter never sent. Miriam Quaid. Her face was pale, drawn. A scar ran from her jaw to her collarbone, half hidden by her shawl. She didn't look at anyone. She looked inward, as though expecting pain. The crowd jeered, loud with the confidence of cowards. $10 for the redhead. "She bites," someone shouted. "I'll take her for 5. 30 for the quiet one. She looks obedient." A laugh rippled through the room. Elias moved toward the bar. Behind it stood Sloan, the saloon keeper. Polishing a glass like this was any other night. He looked up, tried to smile. Failed. "You serving whiskey or selling people?" Elias asked, voice calm as a loaded gun. Sloan glanced down. "Ain't me, Marshal. Just hosting." "I see." One of the bidders, a thick-set rancher with yellow teeth and a sour stink, reached for Letty's arm. She yanked it back and spat at his boots. The man raised his hand. "Don't," Elias said. The word was soft, final. Every sound died. Elias took off his hat, set it on the bar beside his badge. He laid down his rifle like he might a sleeping child, reached into his coat, and withdrew a money pouch. "I'll take all 3, he said. Silence held. Even the wind seemed to hush outside. "Now hold on," the rancher began. Elias turned slowly and looked at him. Not with rage, not with warning, just with a stillness so complete it made lesser men feel hollow. "You can take your money back," Sloan said, his voice nervous, half-whispered. "They ain't. They weren't supposed to." "Write the receipt," Elias said. Letty stared at him like he'd grown horns. Hazel's expression didn't change, but something in her shoulders eased. Just barely. Miriam blinked once. That was all. He turned to them. "You'll come with me. My house is beds. Stove works. You don't owe me anything." They didn't move. Not yet. Outside, snow spiraled past the windows like ashes after a burn. The town held its breath. He didn't touch them, didn't lead them, just walked to the door and opened it wide. Cold air poured in like judgment. and one by one they followed. Miriam stepped down first, slow, holding her shawl close. Letty came second, boots clacking, eyes darting in disbelief. Hazel waited a beat longer, long enough to make Elias glance back. She met his eyes, not with trust, but with something more honest. Curiosity. As the door swung shut behind them, the saloon erupted again. Anger, laughter, someone slamming a glass. But Elias heard none of it. The snow was falling heavier now, sticking to the hem of Hazel's dress, collecting in Letty's hair. Miriam looked up at the sky like it had finally remembered her. They walked side by side down the frozen street. No one said a word. By the time they reached the marshal's house, a squat place near the edge of town with a crooked fence and a sleeping dog on the porch. His coat was rimmed with white. He opened the door, stepped aside, and lit the lamp inside. The yellow light spilled over plain walls, a worn rug, and a table with 4 chairs. Letty crossed the threshold first. She stood in the middle of a room, like she didn't know whether to laugh or run. Hazel stepped in next, removed her gloves, and folded them with grace. Miriam entered last. She moved like someone who knew what it meant to be somewhere warm, but didn't trust it to last. Elias set his hat on the hook, stoked the stove. Water's on the boil. There's bread. Still, none of them spoke. Only when he turned to go toward the small room at the back, where he kept his own silence like a relic, did Hazel say, "Why?" He paused, one hand on the doorframe. "You can't save a thing by watching it burn," he said. "And I've seen too many burn." The door closed behind him. Inside the main room, the women stood in the lamplight, still not sure if they'd been rescued or trapped all over again. But the snow kept falling, softer now, like even the sky was tired of being cruel. The mornings came cold in Eagle's Rest, and colder still in the rooms behind the marshal's house. Frost crawled across the glass like vines made of glass, and the floorboards whispered when stepped on barefoot. In that early quiet, with the stove not yet lit, the 3 women began to sort their places not by words, but by the sound of their breath and the weight of their silence. Hazel Wynne woke first. She always did. She moved with quiet purpose, as if being useful might make her less visible. She boiled water, arranged mugs, set out stale bread and butter that wouldn't soften no matter how long it sat by the fire. She did not speak unless asked a question, and even then answered like a schoolteacher facing a hostile classroom, precise, brief, and polite. Miriam Quaid was the last to rise. She moved like someone expecting the floor to give out. She kept her scarf high, covering the raw path of the old burn on her neck, and never met the other women's eyes until she'd poured her tea. Her fingers shook the most when the room was quietest. Letty Rose did not fit the hush. She was a loud presence even when silent, pacing, fidgeting, muttering under her breath. Her fire was still there, but the edges of her defiance had dulled, shaped now by wariness more than pride. Every time the front door creaked, she looked toward it with a glance too sharp for someone her age. Elias Boone, for his part, said little. He brought wood in the mornings. He fixed the stove when it belched smoke. He left coins on the kitchen table like he was paying tenants, not sheltering souls. He slept in his back room and never locked the door between them. That somehow made it harder. There was no threat to rail against, no sin to name. Just a man who did not touch, did not leer, did not explain. The town, however, was less kind. It started with glances. At the general store, Hazel went to buy soap and needles. The clerk wrapped her goods in rough paper, but never spoke. Behind her, a pair of women whispered into their shawls, voices like knives. She didn't look so holy on that stage, did she? Another voice added, 3 under one roof. Either he's God or he's got no shame. Hazel left without responding, holding the package tight to her chest. That night, she stitched a tear in Elias's coat. He'd left it draped over a chair, not asking. She didn't return it directly, just folded it neatly by the door. The next day, Letty tried to go to the stables, hoping to feed the horses. She loved them, had said as much when no one was listening. But the stable boy blocked her path. "Marshals who don't belong here," he said, not looking her in the eye. Letty spat at the ground and turned back, her fists clenched until her nails bit skin. She kicked a bucket over on her way home. Later, Elias found her in the barn, sitting on a bale of hay, hugging her knees. "I ain't what they say," she said into the dark. "I know," he said. She didn't reply, but she didn't leave either. Miriam was more careful. She never went into town. Every Sunday before dawn, she walked the long trail past the edge of the frozen creek and into the hills beyond. She returned before church bells, always with red eyes and muddied hems. Elias followed her once, riding his horse quiet along the ridge. From behind a stand of pine, he watched her crouch near a small homestead, watching a young boy toss snowballs at a tree stump. She didn't approach, just watched from a distance with her hand pressed to her heart like she was holding something inside that wouldn't stop breaking. The boy never saw her. When she turned back, she moved as if each step took part of her with it. Elias never asked. She never explained. It was Deputy Tom Granger who brought the news that the town council had met. "They think you're keeping them," Tom said awkwardly, hat in his hands. "Like keeping them?" "I know what they think," Elias replied. "You gonna set 'em up somewhere else? Let folks settle down." "They're not dogs, Tom." "No, sir, just saying it might help." Elias didn't answer. Tom left before the silence swallowed him. That night, at dinner, the four of them sat at the long table. Letty picked at her beans. Miriam sipped tea. Hazel broke the quiet first. "Why are you letting us stay?" Her voice wasn't accusatory, just tired. Elias looked up from his plate. "Because no one else did." Letty snorted. "That's it? You some kind of saint?" He shook his head. "No, just tired of watching decent people get trampled, because no one wants to get their boots muddy." Hazel looked at him, really looked. Her gaze softened, just slightly. Later, she lingered in the kitchen, drying dishes as Elias cleaned his rifle. "I used to teach," she said suddenly. "Before all this." "You still could," he replied. "They wouldn't let me in a schoolhouse here. Not now." Elias said nothing, but the next morning she found a stack of books on the kitchen table. Spelling primers, histories, even a reader from Boston. No note, just a quiet offering. In the weeks that followed, small changes took root. Hazel began reading to Letty by the stove, her voice calm and rhythmic, Letty mouthing words like spells. Miriam baked bread one evening, real bread, not the hard crust they'd survived on, and left half a loaf at the preacher's door, without a name. And Elias? Elias began to listen, not just with his ears, but with his whole self. He didn't try to fix what they'd lost. He just made space for them to remember who they were before they were sold. Then came the note, wrapped around a rock and hurled through the front window. It shattered the oil lamp and sent sparks across the rug. Letty screamed. Hazel shielded her eyes. Miriam didn't move. She simply stared at the words scrawled in angry ink. "You can't save whores with a badge." Elias stood in the glass. Wind whipped in through the broken pane. Behind him, the women gathered like shadows. He didn't say a word. He picked up the rock, read the note, and placed it in the stove. Watched it burn. That night, he moved the women's beds into rooms with doors that locked from the inside. The next day, he fixed the window himself, his hands raw from the cold. The gossip only grew. Mrs. Talbot told the pastor's wife that Elias had married all three in secret. A boy from the store claimed he'd seen them bathing together. A drunk at the saloon declared they'd cursed the town, and the harsh winter was God's punishment. But even cruelty wears thin over time. One evening, as snow began to melt into puddles, Elias came home late to find the women sitting by the fire, playing cards. Hazel dealt. Miriam smiled. Letty, hair braided now, laughed at something no one else found funny. He stood at the door and watched for a long moment. Then he stepped inside. They paused, waiting to see who he would be tonight, the lawman, the landlord, the shadow. Instead, he pulled off his gloves, took a seat at the table, and nodded toward the deck. "Deal me in," he said. The warmth that followed wasn't from a fire. Later that night, when the cards had been shuffled back into their box, and the house quieted to creaks and breath, Hazel stepped into the kitchen where Elias stood, staring out at the night. "They'll never stop, will they?" she asked. "Maybe not," he said. "But you don't care?" He looked at her then, something tired and alive in his eyes. I care. I just care more about the one still standing. She didn't answer right away, but before she left the room, she touched his arm, lightly, like a leaf touching water. For Elias, it felt like a bell rung in a church long abandoned. Upstairs, Miriam hummed to herself. Letty slept with her boots by the bed. And outside, spring breathed faint and slow through the cracks of Eagle's Rest. The town hadn't welcomed them, but somehow they were home. By the first warm blush of spring, the snow melted into mud, and with it, the fragile stillness around Elias Boone's house began to thaw. But in towns like Eagle's Rest, where folks survived more on memory than mercy, change didn't come clean. It came crooked. The house had grown gentler inside. You could hear laughter sometimes, soft and unsure, like it was learning to walk again. Hazel polished the windows until light pooled on the floors. Miriam started singing while she cooked, low and breathy. Not quite songs, but pieces of one she remembered. Letty stopped sleeping with a knife beneath her pillow, though she never said why. Elias noticed these things and said nothing. He wasn't a man who held praise easy on the tongue, but he lingered longer at the table, ate slower, looked up more. The town, though, looked harder. One morning, Hazel returned from the dry goods store with her chin high and her eyes brittle. She set a sack of flour on the table too roughly, making the air bloom with dust. "They wouldn't let me buy chalk," she said. Letty, sitting on the counter, swinging her boots, frowned. "What for?" "For teaching," Hazel replied. "I thought maybe I'd start lessons. For the children. There's plenty not in school." "They said no." Elias asked. She gave a short, bitter laugh. "They said, and I quote, 'You're not fit to teach morals to a dog.'" Elias said nothing, only reached for his coat. She stopped him with a look. "Don't. You can't arrest a whisper." Later in the quiet, Hazel sat outside with a slate she'd found and wrote names in careful chalk. Letty Rose, Miriam Quaid, Elias Boone. She underlined each twice. Letty started calling it the list of the unwanted. A week passed before Elias heard the first of the town's threats, not shouted, but carved into the door of the jailhouse in a knife's jagged hand. "Marshal or madman." Tom Granger came by that morning, sweat beading under his hat, not from heat, but from something more nervous. "Town's stirring bad, Marshal," he said, chewing his lower lip. "Said you're setting up a brothel. That the girls are charging for company." Elias cleaned his rifle with slow, careful strokes. "You believe that?" "No, sir. But some do." "Then they're not looking to believe anything else." Tom shifted. "They're talking deputizing someone else. Someone willing to take care of what you won't." "Who?" Tom hesitated. "Calderon. That rancher who lost the bid on Hazel. He's got money, friends. Says the law's gone soft." Elias didn't respond, just clipped the rifle closed. That evening, he rode out to the ridge where Miriam always stood on Sundays. He found her there, arms wrapped around her middle, watching the same boy toss pebbles into a pond. "You ever think about going to him?" Elias asked, his voice low. "Every second," she said. "But I won't bring the storm to his doorstep." "He'd be safer with you. He'd be hated for me." They stood in silence. "Would it have been better," she asked suddenly, "if we hadn't followed you from that saloon?" Elias turned toward her. "No, but it might have been easier." She nodded, as if that was the answer she expected. Back in town, Hazel began holding reading lessons on the porch, using the broken chalk she did have. Children came in secret, dirty-faced, barefooted, eager. Their parents denied it. Some children got pulled away mid-sentence. But Hazel stayed. She wrote the alphabet like it was a prayer. Letty, watching from the steps, muttered, "Ain't nobody scared of sin until it learns to spell." The tension curled tighter with every hour. Mrs. Talbot stood in church that Sunday and gave a testimony veiled in lace and vinegar. "When a man forgets his duty," she said, "the devil builds a house beside his." People murmured agreement. Elias didn't attend. Instead, he helped Miriam plant early beans behind the house. Her sleeves were rolled, arms dirt-streaked. She looked freer in the soil. "You ever married?" she asked suddenly. "I was," he said. "A long time ago." "Is she?" He nodded. "Fever. Took her slow. took the light with her. Miriam didn't answer. She just placed another seed in the earth. Later that night, Hazel read aloud from the Bible, not for worship, but for rhythm, for the beauty of it. Her voice was steady. Letty braided her own hair while listening, fingers more tender than she wanted to admit. Elias dozed in the chair by the fire. Miriam stitched a coat that wasn't hers. And outside, the wind carried word of a meeting. Men gathering under Calderon's porch, voices pitched too low for prayer. The next morning, Hazel found a dead bird nailed to the fence. Blood matted its feathers, wings stretched wide like it was crucified. Underneath, carved into the wood, "Get out." She didn't scream, just pulled it free, buried it in the garden, and kept her hands clenched all day. When Elias saw, he said only, "They're testing how far they can go." "And what happens when they find the line?" Hazel asked. He didn't answer. He went to the barn, sharpened his tools, and oiled the hinges on the door. That evening, as the sun bled out behind the hills, Letty crept into Elias's room. She didn't knock. She just stood there, silhouetted by firelight, her face strange with uncertainty. "I don't want to be scared anymore," she said. "You shouldn't have to be." "But I am. All the time." He nodded, as if she'd said something sacred. She sat on the floor, back to the wall, knees hugged tight. "You ain't like the others. That's what scares them. You keep your hands to yourself." "I was raised right," Elias said. She gave a dry laugh. "No, you were broken honest." They sat there a long while, saying nothing more. In the morning, Deputy Tom came again, breathless and pale. "They're coming tonight," he said. "Not officially, but you know what that means. Pitchforks and liquor." Elias closed the door behind him, turned to the three women seated around the table. "You need to know," he said. "There's a mob coming." "Will you send us away?" Hazel asked. "No." "Will they burn the house?" "Maybe." Miriam stood, slow and calm. "Then we stay." Letty cracked her knuckles. "Let him try." And for a moment the fear stilled. The four of them moved like clockwork. Elias cleaned the guns he never wished to use. Hazel doused the lanterns. Miriam gathered food and water in case they had to flee. Letty nailed the shutters closed and muttered curses like prayers. They didn't eat that night, just waited. But the mob didn't come, not yet. Instead, they heard horses gather in town, voices carry across the air like storm clouds. But the road to Elias's house stayed empty. Tom came by at dawn, hat in hand. "They're waiting," he said. "Building something bigger." Elias asked, "Are you with them?" Tom looked him in the eye, and for the first time, shame settled across his boyish face. "I don't know," he said, "but I ain't against you." Elias nodded. "That's enough." Back inside, Hazel set a kettle on the stove. The silence held like a breath, ready to break. Outside, the town slept uneasy, and the sky above it turned the color of bruised peaches, stained and soft, as if the world itself had seen too much. Inside the marshal's house, there were no saints, no saviors, just people learning to hold their ground. And something in the air promised that the reckoning would come before the next sundown. The wind changed around midnight. It no longer whispered through the shutters like a mourner, but moved with weight, pressing against the marshal's house, as if testing its seams. The dog barked once and fell silent. Snow had melted into slush and left the dirt road thick with mud, but boots were coming anyway. Many paced with confidence and drink. Elias Boone stood at the stove, loading the last log, the flame swallowing it with a hiss. He wore his oldest coat, the one his wife had patched once long ago. On the table behind him sat a pistol, polished but cold, and a badge that had lost its shine. He didn't touch either. In the hallway, Hazel helped Miriam adjust the buttons of her coat. Her hands were steady. Miriam's weren't. Across the room, Letty leaned against the window frame, sleeves rolled, jaw tight. She hadn't spoken in hours. "They're waiting by the church," Hazel said quietly. "You can see the torches from the porch." "They're lighting fire to shame," Miriam muttered. "That's all they've ever known." Elias stepped into the room. "You have one last chance to leave by the back path." "I'll stay and face them." "No," Hazel said, without hesitation. "If we leave now, we're just confirming what they think we are, property hiding." Miriam reached into her satchel and pulled out a letter. "It's to my sister. If anything happens, she'll come for my boy." Elias took it and nodded once. Letty lifted the shotgun from the rack and checked the breech. "They want to see a monster? I'll be one." "No," Elias said firmly. "We don't meet hatred with blood unless we must. They expect violence. What they don't expect is grace." Letty stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign word. But she set the gun down. Hazel opened the front door. The cold spilled in, torches flickering in the dark beyond the fence, where maybe 20 men stood, some neighbors, some strangers, but all bound by the same rope of rage. And Calderon, tall and smug, stood front and center like he was preparing for a duel, not a disgrace. Elias stepped out, coat flapping, his shadow long in the torchlight. He stood on the porch and looked down at them. His voice, when it came, was calm and wide enough to hush a crowd. "This house holds no prisoners, no lies, no shame." Calderon laughed. "It holds whores, Marshal, the kind you paid to keep." Behind Elias, Hazel stepped into the doorway, straight-backed, her hands folded before her. "You lost your bid," she said, "and now you want to call me names to feel bigger." That silenced a few men. Calderon turned red. "You think teaching children redeems you?" "I think kindness does," she replied. "Something you wouldn't recognize if it kissed your boots." Gasps murmured through the crowd. One man shouted, "You corrupt this town." Then Miriam stepped out, holding a small wooden box, her late husband's Bible. She raised it, her scar visible in the torchlight. "This town let me burn once," she said, voice breaking like frost. "Watched my husband die, while men called it an accident. You let my son grow up without a mother. And still I am here, standing." The wind caught her shawl and lifted it like wings. Letty followed, sauntering to the porch edge, arms crossed. "I was sold before I could vote. Played tricks in a traveling tent just to eat. You think I'm dirty because men wanted me? What's that say about you?" She smiled then, a crooked, wicked smile that stung worse than spit. "You want to fight? Bring it. But you'll be seen for what you are." The mob stirred. A few men backed away. But Calderon wasn't finished. He raised his rifle and pointed it directly at Hazel. Elias stepped in front of her, slow and sure, as if blocking a storm with nothing but his chest. "I've arrested men for less," he said. "You've gone soft," Calderon hissed. "No, I've gone honest." Calderon's finger tensed. A shot cracked the night, but not from Calderon. Deputy Tom Granger stepped from the dark, rifle still smoking. The bullet lodged in the dirt at Calderon's feet. "Next one's between your eyes," he said, louder than he'd ever spoken in his life. Eyes turned. A few townsfolk dropped their weapons. Calderon looked around, saw hesitation, saw doubt. "Traitor," he snarled. Tom stepped closer. "You're not the law. You're just loud." Elias nodded once, slowly. "We're done here." But Calderon, either too proud or too drunk on his own bitterness, tried to raise the rifle again. Letty kicked it from his hands before he could even aim. It skidded across the dirt, and she stepped back like she hadn't done a thing. Her smile remained. A murmur rose from the crowd, confusion, then shame, then silence. Hazel stepped forward and raised her voice not in anger, but in tired truth. "You came to destroy something because it made you feel small. But we're not yours to break. We never were." Miriam lit a lantern and held it high. In that light, the mob looked less like men and more like boys playing dress-up in wrath they didn't understand. One by one, they turned away. By dawn, the torches were gone, the road churned to muck, and the house still stood. Inside, Elias sat at the table, head in his hands, not in despair, but in release. The women moved around him quietly, Miriam pouring coffee, Hazel setting a pan on the stove, Letty scrubbing mud off her boots with unrepentant satisfaction. Tom lingered by the door. "You think they'll try again?" Elias shook his head. "They've been seen, and that's what cowards fear most." Tom smiled faintly and left. A few days later, Hazel received a letter, her offer to teach accepted in a schoolhouse just one town over. The ink smudged from weather, but the words were clear. She read it at the table, And when she finished, she looked at Elias. "I'll need to leave soon." He nodded, slow. "I'll come back," she added. He didn't ask her to, but his eyes thanked her anyway. Miriam took a wagon to visit her boy. This time, she brought Elias. She introduced him as a friend. And the boy, wary at first, took Elias's hand and asked if he knew how to whittle. Elias nodded. They sat together for a while. Quiet. Peaceful. Letty opened a tiny shop behind the marshal's house. She fixed saddles and boots and told stories no one asked for. Folks started paying. The laughter stayed. The house, once shunned, became a place where women left bread on the step and children came for reading. No one spoke of the saloon, but they remembered who stood when it mattered. One evening, when the porch light glowed amber and fireflies danced in the high grass, Elias sat with Hazel, sharing a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. "You ever think we were foolish?" she asked. He thought about it. "No," he said. "Just brave." She reached out, fingers brushing his. This time he didn't pull away. The wind passed soft through the eaves. Somewhere down the road, laughter echoed, carried not in mockery, but in memory. In the hush that followed, Elias closed his eyes, breathed deep, and felt something settle in his chest. Not pride, not victory, but something smaller, humbler, belonging. And maybe that was the quiet miracle they'd earned, not by bullets or blood, but by standing in the fire and staying whole. We speak of law like it's iron and writ. But sometimes, law is just the choice to open your door, to light the lamp, to stand when the mob comes, even when your voice shakes. So if you find yourself on a porch in a town that's turned away, remember this. Midnight may come with fire, but it's what you do after that writes your name in stone.